on my dad's side passed away when I was really young, like 5 or 6 years old. So I never got a chance to know him very well. I do remember, though, on the day of his funeral, wondering, well, who's going to be my grandpa now? And that same day, my great Uncle Vernie took a break from all the family things going on that day, and he took me down to the park to play for an hour or so. And from that day on, Uncle Vernie was my grandpa. Now, Uncle Vernie was like a classic example of what Brokaw was talking about in his book, The Greatest Generation Ever. He served our country. He was a combat engineer during World War II in the Pacific Theater. After that, he came home to Marshalltown, Iowa, and gave 37 years of good service to Lennox, building furnaces. And Bernie was just an incredible mixture of both strength and humility. He was the best card player I've ever met, and I don't think anyone is more competitive, and yet no one was a better sport than Uncle Vern as well. And he wasn't that big of a guy, but he had this deep, booming voice. I mean, you just knew when he was in the house. And I wasn't there, but my family just loves to tell me about the day when his youngest daughter was married. My Uncle Vern and his wife Marilyn were the greeters, or they were the hosts for the wedding. And Uncle Vern was so happy and so excited about that day that he greeted everyone very, very enthusiastically. Vern McKibben, father of the bride, pleased to make your acquaintance. I mean, over and over with everyone who came in. Didn't matter where you were within the church. You could hear his voice booming and echoing all throughout. Vern McKibben, father of the bride, pleased to make your acquaintance. You know, it just loved his voice. When he laughed, you couldn't help but laughing because his laugh was so contagious. And then he'd be laughing because you'd be laughing, and you couldn't hardly break out of the cycle. Well, a few weeks before he died of cancer, we went to visit them. And one of the things that Uncle Vern had to do was he had to give me a tour of the house to show me all the repairs that he'd made, all the upgrades that he'd overseen. And I know he was just assuring himself that he had done all that he could to take care of Marilyn for when he passed away. I'll never forget, we went into the backyard and he showed me some of their landscaping back there. It had been bordered with some green tree timbers that he'd put in 10 years before. And would you believe it, Danny? It was rotten to the core. He was very demonstrative whenever he said things. So what he did then is he had them bring back in concrete pavers to border the landscape. Concrete, Danny, concrete, as in permanent. As in Marilyn wouldn't have to worry about it after he was gone. He was all about making that house as maintenance-free as possible. I love the thought of that because I did not get the handyman gene from my dad. And so when we lived in Madison, we repainted our house. I've done that. That's good for me. Don't ever care to do that again. So maintenance-free living is very appealing. But the truth is, everything in this life requires maintenance. There's no such thing as a maintenance-free home. Our careers, they take maintenance. That's why some of us even have to take continuing education every year. Relationships definitely require maintenance. And even God-given missions require maintenance as well. And that's what Nehemiah is going to find out today in Nehemiah chapter 13. So go ahead and turn there. Nehemiah chapter 13, we are wrapping up our Mission Possible series where we've gone through the book of Nehemiah. As you turn there, let me just catch you up a little bit in case you haven't been able to make this whole journey with us. I want to give you some context. This all happened around 444 BC, and most of it happens in Jerusalem. And the people of Jerusalem are in big, big trouble because their city walls had been destroyed. And this was at a day and age where your city was only as safe and secure as your walls were strong. Well, their walls had been destroyed because the people of God in Jerusalem had turned their back on him. They'd become unfaithful. They started worshiping other gods. So God removed his hand of protection from them. An invading army came, laid waste to the city, hauled thousands of Jews to live far, far away in exile. It's awful. But then the people of God started seeking him again. And as a result, God raised up this leader, Nehemiah, who at the time was serving as the cupbearer to the king in the Persian court. They were in control of that whole area in the Middle East at that time. And Nehemiah held one of the most trusted, highest positions in the court. But we got to see how God, through this series of miracles, set Nehemiah loose with the king's blessing to go back to Jerusalem, to go back to his home city and rebuild those walls. And he got there, and it was amazing that in a short time he was able to convince the people to drop everything else that they were working on and join him in this rebuilding project, which they did, and it was incredible. And they rebuilt those walls despite a number of different obstacles. They had to face threats from without because their neighbors didn't want Jerusalem to be strong again. They had to face threats from within because not everybody in Jerusalem was on the same page. Some of the nobles have been taking advantage of the situation to get some of their own countrymen in slavery. On top of that, it's just really hard work to rebuild a wall. And yet God protected them, God sustained them, and they got those walls rebuilt in just 52 days. It's unbelievable. 52 days. Walls that had been in ruins for 140 some years, they rebuilt in 52 days. Even their unbelieving neighbors who were their enemies were in awe and had to go, whoa, now that's a God thing. Now last week we left off in chapter 8 where they were celebrating God's faithfulness for what they had done. All right? We're going to start today in Nehemiah chapter 13. So what I would really encourage you to do this coming week is read Nehemiah chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 and check me on what I'm going to say here. But let me just give you an overview of what happens during those chapters. All right? They had just gathered in chapter 8 to celebrate God's faithfulness. Chapter 9, we see that they gather again about 2 weeks later, not to celebrate God's faithfulness this time, but to come to terms with their own unfaithfulness. All right, now it was time for some soul searching. It was time for some house cleaning amongst the people of God. So when they gathered this time, it wasn't with choice food and with drink. This time, they gathered and they were fasting, and they were wearing sackcloth, which is symbolic of sorrow and of repentance. And that day, the priests recounted the history of their people, which is basically one long comparison and contrast between God's faithfulness and their unfaithfulness. And they were overwhelmed as they realized how unfaithful they'd been. They confessed that, but they even went beyond just confessing, God, we've been unfaithful. They repented. And they let God know, God, this isn't going to be part of our story anymore. With your help, we're going to be faithful to you. And so with that, they made some key commitments that the people of God throughout the centuries have needed to make. Here they are. We see them in Nehemiah chapter 10. The first commitment they made was supporting temple worship and ministry. So they committed to temple worship by paying the temple tax, which that would provide for the priests so they could focus on the ministry there instead of raising their own food. They committed to supplying the wood for the burnt offerings. They committed to bringing in their first fruits to the temple. And this commitment was all about honoring God with their money and possessions. Second commitment they made was to observing the Sabbath. You see, they'd been treating the Sabbath like any other day, and it was just another opportunity for them to make more money. But from now on, they were going to recognize that day as the Sabbath. It was set apart as a day of worship and as a day of rest. That was about honoring God with their time. And the third commitment they made was not marrying non-Jewish neighbors. No longer would they be marrying the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Jebusites and the Edomites. Their neighbors, all of whom had this long history of leading Israel astray when they got into these mixed relationships. So they weren't going to do that anymore. And this was about honoring God with their relationships. So again, 3 key commitments. We're going to honor God with our money and possessions. We're going to honor God with our time. We're going to honor God in our relationships. And they signed the dotted line on that day. They recovenanted with God. And they did this because God had been faithful, but they also knew going forward there was no way they could fulfill their God-given mission in life to point the rest of the world to God if they didn't live by these commitments. It would make no sense for them to say that God is their God if they weren't going to live this way. And so I hope you understand with these principles involved here, those 3 commitments still apply to us today. These are just as relevant to us. But that wraps up chapters 9 and 10, which was all about the people rededicating themselves to living for God. Chapter 11, Nehemiah establishes some policies. Chapter 12 is all about where they have another ceremony, the dedication of the wall. And it was quite a ceremony. But remember that the dedication of the wall followed on the heels of the people rededicating themselves to God, and that's important. Because remember, ultimately, Nehemiah's mission, it wasn't getting those walls rebuilt. That was a means to an end. The ultimate objective in this was getting God's people back on track, being the people of God again. And so now it's mission accomplished for Nehemiah, right? Well, then Nehemiah was recalled by the emperor. He's like, okay, I want you to come back now. And I'm sure as Nehemiah left, he had to feel pretty good. He had seen God move big time. And now everything was as it should be in Jerusalem. But as we're going to see, Nehemiah is going to discover that even God-given missions where he moves big time like he did, even those missions require maintenance. And unfortunately, after Nehemiah left Jerusalem, the spiritual and the social climate there in Jerusalem began to deteriorate. Now, we don't know how long that Nehemiah was gone, but evidently he asked the king for permission to go back to Jerusalem, and miraculously the king granted it. Yes, you can go back to Jerusalem. And so he's on his way back. But if Nehemiah expected to find Jerusalem the way he left it, he's in for a huge, huge surprise. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 4. Nehemiah has arrived back in Jerusalem. Before this, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. All right, now, if you've been with us for this journey, that should trip something for you. If there was a soundtrack, it would be Tobiah, dun, 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 or some dark, ominous music. Because Tobiah was no friend of the Jews. He was no friend of Jerusalem. He was connected to Eliashib through marriage, but this is not good that Tobiah is mentioned here. It gets worse. This Eliashib, the high priest, verse 5, he provided him, Tobiah, with a large room formerly used to store grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. All right, so there's two major errors here. The first one is that the high priest has given a room to Tobiah, one of the greatest enemies of Jerusalem. He shouldn't have been allowed in the city, but now here's the high priest is giving him a room in the temple. Tobiah wasn't even Jewish. He was an Ammonite. It was against the law for him to be in the temple. But that had happened. And what makes it worse is the second thing is the room that was given to him. It was this room that was formerly used to store grain offerings and all the articles that were needed for worship in the temple. Now remember, the first of the big three commitments was that the people were going to support the temple ministry again, and they were going to bring in their tithes and their first fruits. Those rooms should have been full. But evidently that was the collections weren't happening like they should have been. And so how does Nehemiah feel about this? Verse 6. But while this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. And now here's where we learn about his absence for a while. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I had asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased. How displeased was he? He was so displeased, he threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Now, that's no small thing, because Tobiah had been a major power player in that region for a long, long time, longer than Nehemiah had been around, and yet Nehemiah shows up and unceremoniously gives him the boot. Here's your stuff. And he doesn't stop there. Verse 9, I gave orders to purify the rooms. They didn't just kick Tobiah out, he sent the fumigators in afterwards. That doesn't send a message. And then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. So Nehemiah, he didn't mess around, and he dealt with this issue very decisively, but he's not done. Verse 10. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. People weren't providing enough for them. They had to go take care of their own food. Verse 11, so I rebuked. And that's a powerful word being used there. In the Hebrew, it means more than just opposing someone verbally. It means you might even oppose them physically as well. So Nehemiah, he's up in the kitchen. He's probably poking them in the chest. I rebuked the officials and asked them, verse 11, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. Verse 12, all Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. So yeah, the people had slipped away in supporting the temple ministry and all that went on there, even though they had passionately promised God that they would do this, and they signed the dotted line. They had slipped in their commitment. Nehemiah shows up, and he gets them back on track in very strong fashion, cleans house, and the people are tithing. After all that, what does he do? Surprise, surprise, praise. Verse 14, remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. All right, so the Jews had fallen away from one of their big three commitments. How are they doing on these other fronts? Verse 15, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Right, so again, the Sabbath had become just another day, right? Just another day to make some money, just another day to work, just another day to advance my interests. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. Verse 16, people from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked, there's that word again, I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same things so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. Now this is important to note, that Nehemiah wasn't torqued off with the officials and the nobles because they'd crossed him, because they'd offended him. He was upset with them because they were leading the people of Jerusalem back down this path that led them into so much trouble. Verse 19, when evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, because for the Jews the Sabbath begins when the sun sets, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men that he could trust, at the gates, so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. He's taking no chances here. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside of Jerusalem. So they're playing a waiting game. Maybe they're thinking, Nehemiah, he's just arrived back. He's not the one really in charge. We'll let the nobles take care of this. We'll just kind of wait and see what happens. Verse 21, but I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. In the New King James Version, it's, I will lay hands on you. So basically, Nehemiah said, you show up again, I'm going to cuff you, I'm going to stuff you. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Verse 22, then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. So now, much to Nehemiah's dismay, he found that the people had slipped on the second of their big three commitments. They were no longer keeping the Sabbath. And again, Nehemiah has to take drastic action to get them back on track. And again, when all's said and done, Nehemiah prays, remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. So, strike two. Unfortunately, the story's not over yet. Didn't stop there. Verse 23, moreover, in those days I saw the men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Okay, these were non-Jews. God had told them not to marry these people because, again, these people had a long history of leading these people astray. Verse 24, half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. And the implication is, if they're not speaking the language of Judah, they're probably not worshiping the God of Judah. So we see just who's influencing who in these mixed relationships. Verse 25, I rebuked them. But he's done that before. He goes past it this time, though. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. Wow, Nehemiah. We're going further with this, aren't we? Called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Now here he explains why. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, the king of Israel, sinned? And among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by these foreign women. In other words, look, if Solomon, our greatest king, maybe the wisest man ever, if even he couldn't handle this, if even he was being led astray by foreign women, what makes you think you can get away with this? Verse 27, must I hear now that you are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying these women? So, strike three. The three big things these people had committed back to God, they'd slipped up and fallen in all of these categories. They were no longer bringing in their tithes and offerings. They were no longer keeping the Sabbath. They were no longer safeguarding their relationships. So by this point, Nehemiah, he's just ticked. Rightly so. He had given so much to get those walls rebuilt. He had risked so much, including his own life. Enemies from the outside were trying to assassinate him. Nobles on the inside were working against him. I don't think anyone had outworked him. I don't think anyone had out-sacrificed him. He had denied himself privileges to maintain credibility as a leader. He'd given up so much in order to get those walls rebuilt and to get the people back on track. But the stark reality facing him when he got back was that the Jerusalem he came back to was no different than the Jerusalem he first went to. There's just only one difference. The Jerusalem he came back to was cleaner. There wasn't debris all around. It's because the walls had been rebuilt. And Nehemiah knew the only reason those walls had been rebuilt was because God had showed up and had worked on their behalf. And he comes back to find his own people in the very shadow of that wall, in the very shadow of God's faithfulness, had strayed and had forgotten their promises to God. And so he just couldn't stand by and watch this all fall apart in this downward spiral. And so you might think, wow, Nehemiah, he's so extreme. I think he's gone a little overboard. But it's clear that Nehemiah's anger was not out of place. And it's clear that he's the only one who's seeing things clearly. The people of Jerusalem were back on the path that led them to the point where the city lay in ruins, where they were a laughingstock to the people around him, and they were a disgrace to their God. And he couldn't just stand by and watch that happen. That's what this really boils down to. That's why he was so decisive. Now, our hope and prayer is that each and every one of you would experience what it is to have God work through your life and to accomplish a mission that he's given you, and the unique and powerful joy that comes along with that. But I hope you never forget from Nehemiah's story that when that happens, you're not done. Right? When you're done, you're not done. Why? Because even God-given missions require maintenance. Nothing's permanent, as Uncle Vern would say. Time has a tendency to break things down. And as much as we want to say, hey, good, let's go on to the next thing, you're still going to have to monitor and keep an eye on the things that God has done through you. And this maintenance may require drastic action. So when Nehemiah returned, things were beyond just tweaking a few things. Some things required total overhaul. Some people had to be taken behind the woodshed. Some people had to be run out of town altogether. But again, why was he so extreme? It's always going to be extreme when someone takes a moral stand in a culture where standards are declining. It's always going to seem that way. Think Jesus clearing out the temple. But here's the deal when it comes to taking this drastic action. When you take that drastic action, it has to be about guarding the mission and guarding blessability. And that's so important. When we see Nehemiah taking the kids' gloves off here and dealing with things, you never see him throwing a tantrum. You never see him like, oh, I'm so offended. How could you do this to me? How could you make me look so bad? It wasn't about him at all. It wasn't about him at all. It was all about getting the people focused back on God, back in line with their mission. And it was about protecting their blessability. It And when I talk about being blessed, I'm not talking about health and wealth and prosperity. When I talk about being blessed, I'm talking about experiencing the guidance and the grace and the power to do what God has called you to do, and then again, experience that joy, that incomparable joy that comes with that. Because so often, I see people, they have this kind of vague idea that, no, God, he just kind of waves his wand of blessing over us because he's just that nice of a guy. But it doesn't work that way. The blessing of God is found in keeping to the path that he's called us to. And no place else. No place else. And exile and broken walls should have taught the Jews that. But here they are slipping. They'd forgotten that. And so no wonder Nehemiah is willing to jerk hard to get his people back on track. And you might have to at some point jerk hard to get back in line with your mission. But again, it can't be you about having a wounded ego. It has to be about the mission. It has to be about safeguarding blessability. That's how it hits us in our unique lives. But as we wrap up this, I want to speak just a little bit to how this speaks to us as a church as well. Because not only do each of you have God-given missions in your life, we together, we collectively have a God-given mission, just as the people in Jerusalem, they had this mission to point the world to God. And the thing is, those same 3 commitments they made are just as instrumental for us to make as they were for them. And folks, here's the challenge. Here's the challenge that this passage has, especially for us at Mitchell Wesleyan Church. You know, the Jews, they had drifted away from God in the shadow of the wall, in the shadow of his faithfulness. Well, the truth is, as a church, we stand in the shadow of God's faithfulness. With this facility, we stand in the shadow of God's faithfulness. You see, in the not too distant past in the life of this church, God showed up big time. And he worked through the commitment and through the sacrifice of its people. Some of you weren't here for that, including myself. Some of you are here because of that. Because of what God did through the life of this church at that time. And so this story issues a warning to us, a challenge to us. You can lose your way even in the shadow of God's faithfulness. We can't do that. This is not the time to sit back. This is not the time to get complacent. God has not given us this incredible facility for our comfort. He's not given this to us so we can be so proud of it. God has given us this facility so that we can make an even greater impact for him in this community and even in the surrounding communities in this region. God has given us this facility to be a platform so we can go on and to take new ground for his kingdom and that he would be honored in all of this. But for us to experience that, we, all of us together, are going to have to run with those same 3 commitments. This isn't just about having the right pastor in place or the right people on the board. If we're going to do what God has called us to do, we all need to run with these. We've worded it this way. We need to live generous. We need to remember that everything we have ultimately comes from God. And one of the ways that God has called us to worship him, one of the most tangible ways, one of the most practical ways, is to give back our first fruits, the first 10% of what he entrusts us with. Give it back to him through his church. It's not because he needs the money, it's just that he has chosen to work through his people that way. It's how he's chosen to resource his kingdom. And so will you put some feet to your worship? And will you live generous? I know if you've never done that before, it can be very scary to take that step. But I will tell you, I have experienced it time and time again, where 90% with the blessing of God beats 100% I've kept to myself without the blessing of God every time. Every time. Will you live generous? The next commitment we need to run with is we need to live reverent. We worship him with our time. Because ultimately, he's the one who decides how much time we get. So in light of that, can we set aside a day a week, a day that's not like the other days, a day that's not about advancing our agenda, a day that's not about earning more money, and that becomes a day of worship, and a day of rest. I've been in ministry now for 10 years, and the trend that has occurred in our country that I've witnessed is that I've seen average church attendance go from 3 out of 4 Sundays to 1 out of 4 Sundays. And Mitchell Wesleyan isn't immune to that. We've been updating our database here in recent months. And just in the past few weeks, we identified our care list, those people who are active and consider Mitchell Wesleyan their church home. And we have over 1,000 people that consider Mitchell Wesleyan their church home. Our average attendance this year is 535, so just around half. So I'd ask you, especially those of you who are coaches in this room, can you think of any team that would succeed? Can you think of any team that would accomplish its goals and do what it's supposed to do if half the team is missing for all the practices? Will you live reverent? And this isn't about checking a box. This isn't about, did my duty, showed up for church. I've seen this play out over and over and over. It hurts you. It hinders you spiritually if you miss consistently the gathering with God's people. And it hurts us. It hurts us as well. It bumps us off the path of blessability. And so ask yourself, is God really your God? Will you set aside that day that He's called you to set aside? Will you live reverent? And what would happen if we could unite on this? And the third commitment is, will you live pure? God has a plan for relationships. He does. Is there a relationship in your life that is pulling you off the path He has called you to and is beginning to compromise your witness? Because those guardrails that God has put in place, it's not there to deny you fun. That is there to secure for you regret-free joy, and those guardrails are there to position you so you can point others to Him. And the truth is, our culture has impacted the church when it comes to relationships far more than the church has impacted the culture. But will you live pure? Will you honor Him with your relationships? Getting off track with any of these commitments is inviting God, we're forfeiting our blessing. We'll miss out on what He has called us to. And there's so much at stake with this. There's so much at stake with this. And I hope you get this. That's why God has us here. That's why before the dawn of time, He decided that we each would be born where we are, and for this period of time, we would be together. Otherwise, God would just beam us up to heaven the moment we give our life to Him. No, He leaves us here because He wants to work through us. And these commitments are essential with that. That's why I'm pushing harder than what I normally push on a Sunday, because I sense this same urgency that Nehemiah has in this passage. And he wasn't just concerned because of where they were at. He could see where they were heading. And it wasn't good. But the truth is, we all end up somewhere. Nehemiah ended up somewhere on purpose. Nehemiah ended up where he was at the place where he could say, I finished my race. I finished strong. I completed my God-given mission, and I helped God's people along the way. So no wonder he could pray. This is how he wraps up the book. What an incredible ending. He prays, remember me with favor, my God. How would you like that to be your last words? You could pray that prayer in confidence. This prayer, I love it. It is so much bigger than just, God, have mercy on me. This is so much bigger than the prayer of, God, help me squeak into heaven. This is so much bigger than the prayer, God, how much do I have to keep you happy and still be able to do what I want? This prayer, this is the prayer of the one who laid it all out on the line and gave it all up for his God. So he could pray with confidence, remember me with favor, my God. You don't pray that unless you're optimistic. How is God going to remember you? The steps you take from this point on will determine that. It's what will make the difference. And so today we're going to close with a time of worshiping God in song. We're also going to close with a time of response. No, we are still on the front end of a new season in the life of our church. But will you live out the call that God has given his people through the ages that will position us to accomplish what he's called us to, so that we together can complete our God-given mission? Will you live generous? Will you live reverent? Will you live pure? And so up front we have these bricks today. Like, there's no better way to wrap up this series with Nehemiah and his story with these bricks, right? And on these bricks are stamped these 3 commitments. I will live generous. I will live reverent. I will live pure. My church can count on me. And if you're at that spot today and you're like, yeah, my church can count on me. I'm ready to do that. I'll run with these commitments. Might take me a little bit to get there, but I'm ready to take these steps. And if you're at that point today, then during the song, we're going to ask you, just come up. And we want you to take one of these bricks. We want you to take it home with you. And we want you to put it someplace prominent where you're going to see it daily, right? Mission stake maintenance. Put it somewhere where it's going to remind you of what we need to do to stay on track. Take it to your office if you need to, or put it in the kitchen. Put it in your living room. We're going to put ours in the dining room. Is that okay? We're going to put ours in the dining room. But if you're at that spot, we're going to ask you to come up and to take one of these. I'll tell you, you can count on me to live these out. You can count on the leadership of the church to live these out. And we are so hopeful that you will join us in this, because we want that to be your prayer. We want you to be remembered with favor. We want us as a church to be remembered with favor. You pray with me? Heavenly Father, this has been such a gripping journey. Looking at Nehemiah's story, it's been incredible. But I pray that it would also be pivotal for us as a church. I pray that his story would leave a mark on us as people and as a church. The parallels here, it's just no mistake you've had us parked here at this season. We have known your blessing in the past in the life of this church. This church can sing with gusto, "Great is thy faithfulness." God, we want to carry that into the future. There's no doubt about your faithfulness, Lord. You wait for us. You wait for us. You will not do this without us. And God, for some who are going to come forward today, this is just a reaffirmation of the way that they've been living. I am so thankful for that. It is such a joy of pursuing you side by side with people who are all out in their commitment. Some who come up today, Lord, for them it might be a recommitment. It might be getting back to some things that they've slipped on, some things that they've let go. But God, I know that you're excited about that. You celebrate that. And there might be some who are coming up today, and this might be the first time they've ever made a commitment like this to you, or have made a commitment like this to a church. And it might take them a while to fully run with these commitments. But Lord, I know that you are blessed and honored and excited about that as well. And we pray, Lord, for your guidance so they know what steps to take, Lord. And we pray for your grace and your courage and for endurance, Lord, so that they can get up to full speed as quickly as possible. God, we can only wonder what you do through us if you find us faithful. But we want to see it. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.